The evolution of colonial government was a long process. The English system of government has had a large impact on English colonial government. The bicameral system of parliament has had a significant influence on many of the colonies. Enlightenment philosophers also had a profound impact on the development of the colonies with many of their ideas. Our government relied on the views of these philosophers and the English government. All throughout history, many governments have had their king have most or all of the power. This began to change in England when the Magna Carta first came into play. The Magna Carta was created in order to limit some of the powers of King John. The king had to follow the law just like everybody else. The people and Parliament gained many more rights from this document. This was the first major step towards England's democratic government. Later on, England went through a period of time known as the Glorious Revolution. This was when Edward and Mary became the rulers of England. Before they took the throne, they had to sign the English Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights took power away from the king and queen. Parliament gained two more abilities which limited the king's power. The king could not tax without the approval from the representatives within Parliament. The king also lost his power to abolish parliamentary laws. Along with Parliament, the citizens of England gained a lot more rights. They had the right to a fair trial by a jury of peers, no cruel and unusual punishment, and the right to petition the king. These new additions were very similar to some of the amendments in the U.S. Constitution. The parliamentary system inspired the colonies in different ways. One of the major ways that the Parliament inspired the colonies was with the idea of a representative government. When the colonists first arrived in America, they didn't have a system of government, so they decided to form a representative system of government like in England. The colonists were inspired by the House of Commons and the House of Lords in England. The members of the House of Commons were elected by the people, and the House of Lords represented the nobility of England. You can see this inspiration through many of the governments in the colonies. Some examples of representative government in the colonies were the Mayflower Compact and the Virginia House of Burgesses. The Mayflower Compact was when the colonists aboard the Mayflower sent representatives to meet, and they created the Mayflower Compact. When they arrived in Plymouth, they met together many more times to make more decisions. The Pilgrims brought one of the earliest forms of a representative government to the colonies by choosing members of their family to represent them. The Virginia House of Burgesses was almost identical to the English Parliament. The royal governor was similar to the king, and the governor's council was similar to the House of Lords. These positions were appointed by the king. The people in Virginia would vote for men called Burgesses, who would go and represent them in the House of Burgesses. The Burgesses were similar to the House of Commons. Many of the Enlightenment philosophers had an impact on the colonial government. Of all of them, John Locke was perhaps the most influential philosopher. In his essay, The Two Treatises of Government, Locke wrote about the way he views government and how they should control the people. During that time period when he wrote his essay, people believed in the divine right to rule, which was the idea that God chose the ruler of a nation. He was inspired by the Glorious Revolution, which contradicted the belief of the divine right to rule, and he wrote his essay. In his essay, he said, "A government is formed requiring the consent of the individuals within the community, and it being necessary to allow the community to function as one body, and so everyone is bound by their consent to be concluded by the majority." He is saying that the government gets their power to govern the people when they receive the permission of the people. Everything else in his essay was based on this principle. This was the idea that the colonists used for representative governments later on. This concept is still in effect to this day. John Locke's idea of consent of the governed is a very important one that has influenced colonial government and our government. Thomas Hobbes was another Enlightenment philosopher who changed the views of these colonists. Hobbes wrote a book called The Leviathan, which is about how the government keeps the people in control. He said that we should invest the power into one person called the Leviathan. He writes about an absolute monarchy in his book, which was used early on in some of the colonies. Rousseau was another Enlightenment philosopher who influenced the colonists. His work, The Social Contract, was based on the ideas of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. The social contract was about the sovereign being the people and the people making the laws. His work was elaborating on what Locke and Hobbes had done years earlier. The concept of a direct democracy was created by Rousseau and later used by the colonists and us. These philosophers' concept, the English system of parliament, and the views of Enlightenment philosophers have influenced the English colonial government by a great deal. The colonial government was the first step that led to our modern government. Without the colonial government, we wouldn't be where we are today.